record this. So let me.
Yes, AJ,
we are recording now. Wonderful.
Because, we want this, it's a 4-session course, but life being what it is, people can't always make all 4 sessions.
Absolutely.
And we're recording them. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And here we are at 7 o'clock. So I'm going to spotlight our facilitator for the evening, which is the Reverend Joe Von Roo.
Hey friends, it is so delightful to see all of your faces here tonight. Some I know and some I do not. Welcome to our course. We're so excited to present this for you. I'm the Reverend Joe Von Roo. I serve at May Memorial Unitarian Universalist Society in Syracuse, New York. I'm going to get us started with a chalice lighting. So if you have a chalice with you or behind you or near you, please do grab it and we can all light our chalices together. Our chalice lighting words come from the Reverend Heather Januels, and she writes, "Our prophets died for the freedom of faith. We are here in their spirit. We are here to practice and sustain our living tradition. To light a chalice claiming for justice the heat and power of fire. In our free faith, we are here, seeking freedom from despair, the freedom to be loved as ourselves, and the freedom to grow beyond imagination. We are here, gathered in the name of all that we find holy. Let us give thanks for the gift of gathering here together." And to introduce our speaker and lecturer, the Reverend John Burens. He was past president of the Unitarian Universalist Association from 1993 to 2001. He served congregations in Tennessee, Texas, New York, Massachusetts, and California before retiring in 2017. He is the author and co-author of many books. His most recent, Conflagration: How the Transcendentalists Sparked the American Struggle for Racial, Gender, and Social Justice, which is why we are here today. So welcome, John. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Joe, that's wonderful. The overall framing of this course is Transcendentalism Then and Now. Because one of the things that I want to point out is that we Unitarian Universalists, as we exist today, would not be who we are without the Transcendentalists. And there is a far greater continuity than is ever expressed in most of the places that we study our Transcendentalist forebears. And let's face it, most of us get introduced to them in literature classes. In high school or in college, it's an English teacher who says, read a little essay by Emerson or a few poems, read a little Emily Dickinson. By the way, she's not always acknowledged as a Transcendentalist, but boy, was she. And Henry David Thoreau. Walden is now the most widely assigned and most widely read American book from before the Civil War. And while I honor the literary heritage of Thoreau and Emerson, I wrote this book in no small part to lift up the Transcendentalists as A, religious people, and B, social activists. You'll hardly ever find an English teacher in high school or college who will tell you that all of the Transcendentalists in the first 2 generations were Unitarians, all of them. That Transcendentalism begins as a spiritual and moral revival movement within the Unitarian churches of New England. And you won't find many people who don't immediately think of the center of Transcendentalism as being in lovely but semi-rural Concord, Massachusetts. Indeed, there's a new book out by Robert Gross called The Transcendentalists and Their World. And in Gross's interpretation, their world centers around Emerson and Thoreau and the town of Concord, which happens to be where Professor Gross lives. I've just written a review of that book, which is really a splendid piece of local history and a splendid piece of social and cultural background to Emerson and Thoreau and Alcott and a few others. But the Transcendentalist movement is certainly much more urban than that impression would suggest. Why do I say that? I would place the center of the Transcendentalist movement, among other things, with a woman. Because the women always get left out of the story in the way these things come down. And Elizabeth Palmer Peabody and her bookstore on West Street in Boston was, without question in my mind, the spiritual hub of the Transcendentalist movement. That's where they went to get the latest literature that was coming from Europe. The idealists of German and French and British background, the romantics, if you will, because those terms were all very much in the air of the 1830s when the Transcendentalist movement first takes shape. But here's the other thing about the movement. They hardly ever met in Concord when they were emerging as a minister's study group. Well, or Arliss Unger is on here. She's been part as a layperson of a group called Collegium. In a sense, the Transcendentalist circle, as it emerged in 1836, very quickly morphed from being just ministers to being a group that included like-minded lay people. Like-minded. Well, James Freeman Clarke, who is the youngest member of that original Transcendentalist circle in 1836, and the thread figure that runs through my narrative about them, once said that the Transcendentalists were like-minded in the sense that no two of them thought alike. If that doesn't sound like contemporary Unitarian Universalism, I don't know what does. We are like-minded in certain ways. There are principles, there are goals, there's a vision without which the people perish that I think is very common among us. You call it the beloved community, if you will. It's a secularized version of the kingdom of God being manifest here on earth. Dick Gilbert at First Unitarian in Rochester was always great in making the connection between the beloved community, as Dr. King spoke of it, and the Transcendentalist vision. Now, let me say a little bit more about why my book has the structure that it does, or the title. Conflagration originally was the title just of the prologue of the story as I tell it. The conflagration of the steamer Lexington on Long Island Sound on the 13th of January, 1840, in which 138 people perished at sea amid burning bales of cotton, including the abolitionist and transcendentalist minister, Charles Follen, who in our circles is often remembered only because his German origins caused him to bring the custom of lighting a Christmas tree and have that popularized by Harriet Martineau when she was visiting the Follen home in Cambridge. What gets forgotten is that Charles Follen had the courage to stick with his abolitionism, even when he knew it was going to cost him his job as an instructor at Harvard, where he taught German and philosophical theology and ethics. He did lose that job. In the conflagration of the steamer Lexington in 1840, he was coming back from New York, where he had tried out as the Unitarian minister at the church that I later served, All Souls. They didn't take him. He was an abolitionist. It is hard for us to remember how often the first generation of Unitarians were tied up with the cotton trade that depended upon slave-picked cotton in the South being brought to mills in the Northeast that were making Unitarians rich. Follin's death precipitated a crisis about how our congregations were governed. William Ellery Channing, who was the mentor of all of the people who formed the first Transcendentalist circle, mentor to Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, and Theodore Parker, and George Ripley. Follin's death caused Joseph May, Samuel Joseph May, whose name is remembered in Syracuse at May Memorial, to go to Channing and say, the Anti-Slavery Society would like to do a memorial service, but it clearly should be at your church, Dr. Channing, where he was ordained, mentored by you. I've prepared the eulogy because I know you have been hesitant to be confrontative with the people in your congregation who think abolitionism is too radical and that it will disturb the economics of the Northeast. But surely you can open the service and offer the prayer. And Channing replied that he'd have to ask the trustees for the use of the building for such a purpose, but he was initially given it. And then when the trustees met among themselves without Channing present, they said, no memorial service for an abolitionist. We own the building. We are the trustees of the pew owners, and we forbid it. The way I tell the story of Channing's reaction is to say that he essentially said, all right, it seems to be a matter of money with you. I have been ill. He was coming down with tuberculosis, which almost everybody had, but he only had 2 more years to live. And I've been turning more of my duties over to my associate, who seems to be more to your liking. So it's Reverend Gannett, whose son later became the minister at First Unitarian in Rochester. You see all these continuities? So Channing said, I won't take your money anymore. I won't resign as your pastor unless you want to dismiss me as your pastor, because I am still concerned for your souls, which are more tied up with materialism than the spiritual goals of religion. He essentially resigned in place. They didn't dare dismiss him. He was too revered by everyone. But that episode was typical of what was going on in the governance of Unitarian churches in Boston in 1840. Across the way, there was another Unitarian church at Hollis Street where the minister had been challenging the trustees about using the basement of the church to hide a rum warehouse that produced income. And he preached about it every Sunday until the congregation decided that they needed to bring in a council of ministers and lay leaders and see if they couldn't change or separate the pastoral relationship with John Pierpont. Well, that story and George Ripley's unhappiness at the Purchase Street Church, where his congregation was now located in a harbor side area that was rapidly becoming a slum and an area where prostitutes and homeless people were on the street all around them. And the congregation was not doing anything about it. Precipitated in 1836, 4 years before the conflagration of the Lexington, some of the younger ministers, led by Ripley, but with Emerson among them, coming together and saying, we need a study group to find out how we can bring about a real spiritual and moral revival among these Unitarians who are too often simply patting themselves on the back for how smart we are not to believe in the Trinity, and relying on what we were all taught, a kind of supernatural rationalism, which is based on materialism, on John Locke's notions of how we learn and understand things. We need to shake things up. And by golly, some of us have been reading Coleridge and Carlyle, and behind them, they're lifting up the Germans who have been influenced by Immanuel Kant. So if you want to know where the term transcendental comes from, it comes from Immanuel Kant, who said that before we have understanding that is formed by our empirical experience, there are certain transcendent categories that we use to sort out what is good and evil, transient and permanent, to use Theodore Parker's term, or eternal. Our intuitions about good and evil and temporality and eternity, the spiritual and moral dimensions of our being are transcendent. And we need to pay attention to the fact that these categories are critical to getting beyond the mere calculative materialism of an empirical approach to understanding. The merchants are full of that. We who are religious leaders need to be putting before them the challenges of these transcendent realities. In no small part, they wanted a more passionate liberal religion, one that actually was grounded in the categorical imperative that Kant also pointed to. The moral imperative that suggests that I cannot become the spiritual and moral being that I am meant to become unless I care about you and you and you and your full flourishing. Oh, and by the way, that means I can't treat any human being, any fellow human being, as anything less than a moral and spiritual agent, not an object of my convenience, or someone who can be treated as having no agency the way many women were treated. I mean, almost no legal rights to even own property, much less vote or be educated beyond a certain level. And I certainly cannot abide slavery, where my fellow human beings are treated as property. Right from the beginning of the Transcendentalist circle in 1836, the first concern was the reform and revival of the church, the Unitarian church, to get it beyond the corpse cold Unitarianism of Brattle Street, as Emerson put it, and into a more passionate engagement with the real issues of the time, which included industrialization, the growth of slavery. And at the time of the American Revolution, by the way, many people had legitimately felt that slavery was going to die a slow but inevitable death, economic death, because it was not all that productive until the invention of the cotton gin, and until Andrew Jackson stepped in and cleared the whole of the American Southeast of its Native American population, something Emerson, to his credit, protested. And cotton lands expanded across Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, etc., into Texas. By the way, one of the discoveries that I made in understanding the context in which our transcendentalist forebears operated was to realize that they were impacted heavily by the economic collapse called the Panic of 1837, right after they started meeting. We can analogize this to the panic that we went through just, what was it, 13 years ago? The Great Recession, which was brought about by speculation, right? Speculation then in chopped up mortgage securities and banks ruthlessly lending money to people that they knew couldn't pay in order to garner more fees. Well, back in 1837, guess what the speculation was in? Cotton lands and field hands. Jackson had killed the National Bank, the second bank of the United States, which was their version of what we call the Federal Reserve today. And so every local bank was printing its own currency and making its own loans. There was almost no supervision. And they were lending money like mad to buy more cotton lands and to buy more slaves. Slavery didn't go away, did it? In fact, it was becoming much more economically a part of the American system than anybody had ever expected when the Constitution was written. So in 1837, the British, who were buying the cotton for their textile mills, noticed the price of cotton dropping as there were more and more cotton fields and more field hands, and they started calling in the loans. It was a 10-year depression. So our forebearers of faith in Transcendentalism got their start during a depression. There's something there about the way we tend to look at our thriving as a religious people. We don't do well when times are good. We do better under crisis, if we have the discipline and the wisdom to reignite the passionate commitment that our forebears showed in the 1830s and all the way up to the Civil War. I will claim, by the way, that the Civil War represents, in the 19th century, the high watermark of Unitarian influence. And in the 20th century, the high watermark of our influence was after Selma, through the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and the enormous cultural change that took place in the 60s and early 70s, which is when I came into Unitarian Universalism. We then get complacent. This was the great complaint that the early Transcendentalists had about the Unitarians of their own time, that they had become complacent and self-congratulatory. Many of them, as I point out in the book, were grandchildren of revolutionaries. Theodore Parker's grandfather, Captain John Parker, led the Minutemen on the Battle Green at Lexington. Emerson's grandfather, William Emerson of Concord, watched the fight break out at the Old North Bridge the same day, April 19th, 1775. Margaret Fuller's grandfather was accused of not being revolutionary enough and left his pulpit in Princeton, Massachusetts, in order to go into politics. And recently I've discovered that her father, who became a congressman, was adamantly opposed to bringing Missouri into the Union as a slave state and spoke against it. But mostly they were legitimately concerned that their parents had become sort of complacent. So they wanted to revive, I'm reminded of the old saw that children and their grandparents have a great bond because they have a common enemy. The middle generation, which surrounded the War of 1812 and the like, was very materialistic in the Northeast and concerned about preserving New England trade with Britain and for preserving the factories that were developing. And this materialism drove the young ministers. And by the way, Emerson was 33 when he went to his first meeting of the Transcendentalist Circle. The oldest member of the group was 40. Wow. Converse Francis, who was regarded as the old man and therefore made the moderator of the first meeting. James Freeman Clark was 22, just out of college, or just out of Harvard. So was Theodore Parker, same age. They gradually brought in people like Bronson Alcott, whom was an educator, not a minister, never been to college, actually. But Emerson said that he was so inspired by Alcott's approach to education that he considered him a, quote, God-ordained priest. Why? Because Alcott's approach to education was all about seeing that child as a moral and spiritual being, not a vessel to pour, memorization into, but as somebody whose ideas needed to be brought out, which is what education in its root term means. And then Emerson and Clark were the two key people in the group who brought in Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, another educator, today remembered primarily for contributing the kindergarten movement in America, but oh, she was so much more. She was an inspiration to Channing. She was the key person in putting big ideas in front of so many of the people. She was ruthless in challenging people for not living up to their potential. Well, let me say a few words about their spiritual disciplines. One of them was that they were often quite confrontative with one another. They would say, Peabody particularly, read some of her letters. You've sent me this niece of yours. She is lazy. She doesn't read. She will not share her ideas. I believe that you've been teaching her to be passive. As though that were the most important thing that a young woman could learn. To be quietly flirtatious in the corner of the parlor. I must differ with you. She writes this to the mayor of Boston. So they were fairly direct because they were concerned about the full flourishing of human souls. Secondly, they were really reflective. They weren't just confrontational. When they confronted, it came out of deep and serious reflection and study. Emerson spent 3 hours in his study every morning before he did anything else. He wrote in his journal every day. So did they all, by the way. Thoreau only started keeping a journal after he graduated from Harvard and moved back to Concord to help his family in their pencil business and to try to be a teacher. Both of them somewhat failed enterprises that didn't quite fit the shape of his soul. But they kept thinking reflectively. I don't know about you, but I keep a journal. It's me being honest with myself. Just in the past week, I found myself in a deep funk. I mean, there's so much out there to be pessimistic about and worried about. And I actually skipped a meeting at church because I thought I'm in too sour a mood. The next day, I sat down with my journal and asked myself what was behind that. And the more I actually named the things that I know I can't control, the more my attitude, which is something that I can control, began to slowly shift. Journaling as a spiritual discipline. By the way, Emerson was communing with the wisest spirits of the past and of his own time in the rest of his time in his study. Secondly, conversation. That's what I hope we're going to have following my remarks this evening. Real conversation. I hope you're putting some thoughts or questions into the chat. Joe's going to lead the Q&A following all of this, but the real unfolding of more spiritual life and more moral understanding is in conversation. They did it even when they couldn't be with one another. We do it by Zoom, but they did it by letter. One of the things that I worry about from our time is who's going to preserve all of these recordings and all of these conversations. It is a treasure trove to go through the letters that our Transcendentalist forebears shared with one another. And they were often in the service of spiritual friendships that were transcending real differences in religious ideas. They didn't all think alike about religion. They were in different places about how they thought, say, the gospel should be interpreted. You know, Alcott got into big trouble because when the kids would come to him and ask him about certain Bible lessons that were in the school he was leading, Mr. Alcott, what's circumcision? What's a virgin birth? He gave them biological answers, which was considered obscene. Elizabeth Peabody actually advised him not to do that. It shut down the school, by the way. So the conversations and differences that they had, many of them, well, they finally came up with, let's have some sessions like the one I think we're having, where everybody's invited to share their ideas. Margaret Fuller's Conversations for Women. Starting in 1839, in Elizabeth Peabody's home and bookstore at 13th West Street, is absolutely the font of 19th century American feminism. By the way, Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to one of the last series in that. This gets forgotten, partly because of the split in the women's movement after the Civil War, which I'll get into later. By the way, next week is going to be all about the women Transcendentalists. But let's just rehearse for a moment some of these spiritual disciplines. Spiritual friendship, transcending differences. I am convinced that they deliberately sought out people who would challenge them and who would also care about them at the same time. People who transcended, who had differences of social class, education, gender, and the toughest one, race. If there's a friendship that is paradigmatic in my book, it's the friendship between Margaret Fuller and James Freeman Clarke. They really got to know one another, one might say almost intimately, although I don't think it was at all a sexual relationship, when they studied German together. Clarke had learned German at Harvard from Charles Follen, who is a forgotten figure in bringing German idealism to the Transcendentalist movement. Margaret wanted to learn German. They were studying Goethe, and Margaret's first book was a translation of Eckermann's Conversations with Goethe in his old age. Clarke goes on to become the first Unitarian minister in what was then considered the frontier, Louisville, Kentucky, where he published The Western Messenger and asked Margaret for her first essays and book reviews. He helped turn her into an author. She, by the same token, was writing to him saying, I read your last letter about where you said you got in front, tried to preach without notes, and the energy just flowed out through your fingers and you couldn't find your words. Let me send you some outlines of some sermon ideas. This is mutual encouragement to become more fully the person you're meant to become. This morning in preaching for the Rochester congregation, I talked about the lifelong friendship between Frederick Douglass and Theodore Parker. There are other friendships in this book that transcend race. John Andrew, who was a young member of Clarke's congregation in Boston, a lawyer, later becomes the Civil War governor of Massachusetts, has a remarkable relationship with Black abolitionist Lewis Hayden. By the way, only in the last year has a scholar at Princeton University, Peter Wierzbicki, actually had the guts to say, yeah, there were Black transcendentalists. It may have started among white Unitarian ministers and other white Unitarian lay leaders, but there was a whole group on Beacon Hill in Boston, which was the center of the Black community then.
Oh, wow.
That regularly brought in transcendentalist speakers and whose thinking clearly became transcendentalist. That is, no longer tied to biblical literalism or formalism. And by the way, Frederick Douglass falls in that category. There is now no question at all in my mind that after the 1850s, as a result of his interaction with people like Theodore Parker, Frederick Douglass becomes America's leading African-American abolitionist, but also its leading African-American transcendentalist. So, some people use narrow definitions of who the transcendentalists were. I see this as a spiritual, moral, intellectual movement that has had impact through the generations. A lot of histories of the Transcendentalists will stop with the Civil War. I don't. You have Emily Dickinson writing in the middle of it, partly out of the remarkable spiritual friendship that she has with one of the most radical Unitarian Transcendentalist ministers, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. we'll get into that a bit further down the line. But Higginson goes on to live into the 20th century and at his own death be somewhat tied up with the emerging NAACP. And by the way, do you know how the phrase, the moral arc of the universe is long but bends toward justice, from Theodore Parker got to Martin Luther King? Through W.E.B. Du Bois and the first journal of the NAACP. Why? Because among the founders of the NAACP was John Haynes Holmes, whose grandfather had been the treasurer of Parker's church. Now, if you want to limit Transcendentalism to just the pre-Civil War period, I won't go with you, because I see us as Transcendentalists today. That's why the title of this course, Transcendentalism Then and Now. If you draw on spiritual resources that transcend the biblical tradition, you do it because Elizabeth Palmer Peabody published the first Buddhist text in American English, because Emerson studied the Upanishads and the Sufi poets, because the Vedas were on Thoreau's little table in his cabin at Walden. If you care about the environment as that reality that transcends us all, and yet of which we're a part, we owe an enormous amount, going all the way back to Emerson's first book, Nature, and to the kind of careful study of climate change that Henry David Thoreau was doing, watching when things budded around the pond at Walden. If you care about women's rights, you owe Margaret Fuller more than you know. And if you care about the continued dismantlement of arrogant white supremacy and the residue of slavery and Native American genocide in this country, you owe a lot, and you should study a lot, our Transcendentalist forebears. We are their spiritual heirs. The question is, will we understand them deeply enough to begin to practice the disciplines that help them through times of trouble, and now are needed to help us through what are, without question, still troubled times? And with that, I think I'll end the sermon. Joe.
John, thank you so much. I have definitely learned a little bit more, even though I served in Concord and knew quite a bit about the Concord Transcendentalists. Thank you for enlightening me further. We'd like to open up this time for questions. If you have a question, I invite you to raise your hand physically, or if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little button that says reactions. It's probably on the lower right-hand corner. If you click on that, you'll see a little button that says raise hand. Please feel free to also do that, whichever makes you more comfortable. I see Douglas Taylor has already raised his hand. Reverend Taylor.
Doug, how great to see you.
Hello, John, and hello, Joe. What a wonderful session this is. And I'm really excited that you're opening it up for conversation. And I wanted to check in about something. I've long loved the Transcendentalists, and it comes out in my preaching as well. Thank you for doing this. One of the critiques that I've bumped into about Emerson in particular was with his theology, but the Transcendentalists in general, is that it's fairly self-focused and individualistic. And it could be that that's kind of just the interpretation that generations have come up with. But can you talk to the counter narrative of that the Transcendentalists were not hyper individualistic and go it alone, Thoreau out in the woods all by himself kind of a thing? Because I know that that's not accurate. Can you lift up some of the communal element of it?
Absolutely. Well, one of the reasons that I decenter Concord and decenter its leading transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, and Alcott, is that there's no question they were the most individualistic representatives of the movement. Anybody who writes an essay, as Emerson did, on friendship and includes the sentence, "Most men descend to meet," is not exactly accessible. And Margaret Fuller found Emerson extremely frustrating as somebody to really talk with freely. There's a reserve there. Now, I have a certain amount of understanding out of his own biography of where that came from. I mean, read Robert Richardson's magnificent biography, Emerson, The Mind on Fire, which opens with the scene of Emerson at age 8, walking behind his father's casket through the streets of Boston. Think about the loss that he experienced when his first wife died. Right before he published Nature, his brother Charles died. When his son Waldo was 8, young Louisa May Alcott came to the Emerson house looking for a playmate. And overnight, young Waldo had died of scarlet fever. And Emerson stood in the doorway and said, "Little girl, he is dead," and closed it. He was driven into himself by tragedy. So I have compassion for Waldo. But he is not representative of the Transcendentalist movement as a whole. He left the ministry. Most of the Transcendentalists did not. Clark, Peabody, he was not a minister, lay leader, Theodore Parker, all of the most important people who actually stirred up the social dimension of Transcendentalism stayed in the church and reformed it. They took it from being owned by the pew owners to make it a voluntary organization, and one in which the social dimension was absolutely critical. So I tried to set up the narrative to show that, among other things, the James Freeman Clark Church of the Disciples in Boston, often forgotten, comes out of Channing not being able to do the fallen memorial service. Peabody helping, well, the Channing family joins it. Without James Freeman Clark, Theodore Parker wouldn't have had a hearing in Boston and become the great orator of the Transcendentalist movement. So the counter narrative, Doug, is that the bulk of our Transcendentalist forebears were church people, not individualists. And they were far more committed with less ambivalence to social reform than, say, dear Waldo was. He comes haltingly to social reform. Are they my poor, he says? So he's not my favorite transcendentalist, nor do I think he is even the most typical. I don't think he ever read Kant. Relatively few people did, frankly. But Frederick Henry Hedge, who'd studied in Germany, and Parker, and even, I found this amazing, young Thomas Starr King, who brought Transcendentalism to the West Coast, really tried to wrestle with Kant and the implications of a categorical imperative in the moral life. Emerson had a tendency to identify idealism with Plato. And that connection can be made intellectually, but it can't be made morally. So I hope that helps. My wife always tells me, keep your answers short, John.
Thanks, Douglas. Are there others who have questions they would like to ask? Again, you can raise your hand electronically or physically, and I will try to spot you.
Well, I got my hand up.
Who is that? Go ahead.
Okay, this is Tom Elliott in Binghamton. And
Hey, Tom, go ahead.
I'd like to ask, how do you, John, think the Transcendentalists would think consider what I see as a tendency in contemporary Unitarian Universalism to equate liberal with secular?
Oh, very good question. One of the things that is often overlooked in the background to the emergence of Transcendentalism was the disestablishment of the church. We forget this, but the standing order of congregational churches in Massachusetts, which had already split into a Trinitarian and a Unitarian wing, was the last state in the Union to have an established church where the churches were supported by tax money until 1833. Notice the Transcendentalists come along just 3 years later. This is partly because all of a sudden in places like Concord, Ezra Ripley, who had been the minister of the only church, Emerson's step-grandfather, by the way, finds that some of his people, to his shock and surprise, are not satisfied with his rational Unitarianism. They want, frankly, a more passionate and, shall we say, in the general way, evangelical approach to living a Christian life. And they form a Trinitarian congregational church. Thoreau's aunts all join it. And it becomes more engaged in abolitionism than the Unitarian parish in Concord did. So, Tom, can you repeat your question so I don't wander too far from it? Are you there?
Yeah, I was thinking more in the context of separation of church and state means that the church has no role in public affairs.
Oh,
Not base a political position
yeah.
on our individual religious beliefs. It must be secular.
Mm. So I think right in this period, you've got all of that being worked out, and partly, so the churches are no longer going to be supported by taxes, and the Transcendentalists are glad of that, because they don't want to be controlled by, they want a more voluntary church. Clark's congregation, called the Church of the Disciples, had three basic principles. The voluntary principle, which meant that the church would be governed by the people who adhered to its covenant and contributed whatever they could to its support. But it was not going to be controlled just by the rich pew owners who built the building. And the social principle, which meant that they'd get together between services to educate one another on the social and moral problems of the time and what they prayerfully thought needed to be done. Clark's congregation did remarkable stuff. The very first project they took on was developing a home for women who were fleeing domestic abuse. In the 1840s, nobody was doing that. Their second project was a retirement home for impoverished women of color. Because they looked around, who's doing this? Nobody's doing this. Maybe we should. So the social principle was tremendously important. And they did think that there were things that should be done by government. Like, how about free public education? I tell the story of how Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, who had a tendency to try to fix everybody, bring out the best of them. She's in a boarding house run by Clark's mother on Beacon Hill, and who moves in but Horace Mann, who is a state senator who is paralyzed by grief because his wife has died of TB. Peabody takes Horace Mann to hear William Ellery Channing on Easter. There have been 2 deaths, one of them due to tuberculosis, another a tragic death in childbirth, within Channing's own family. And he preaches a kind of Unitarian understanding of life eternal. Well, Peabody was not all that confident that this would get through to Horace Mann, but it absolutely transformed him. And she brought him then to a personal conversation with Channing. And Channing said, I understand you grew up in a town where you could only go to school for 6 weeks in the winter. I understand you've been concerned about the quality of the public schools. I think your mission is to work on public education for children from the working classes. Horace Mann resigned from the state Senate, where he was the president of the state Senate, where he could have been a United States senator or the governor of Massachusetts, to become the first state superintendent of public education in the United States, and to launch the whole movement for, let's say, semi-secular public education. Because back in those days, oh boy, there were fights over what that really meant. Could the Catholic kids hear the Catholic version of the Bible? And back then, by the way, there was going to be some religious education in school. I could go on about how I still think we should teach about religion in our public schools without pushing a particular sect or creed. Anyway, it's clear to me that our Transcendentalist forebears were quite good at doing some things that we're not all as good at. And that includes understanding that there's no such thing as an aspect of public life that doesn't have a spiritual, moral, and therefore religious dimension. And that has to be engaged out of the best of our own spiritual convictions. But they were constantly testing those against the convictions of others. against more evangelical people, looking at non-Christian sources. So they were hardly, they were opening up their minds, but they were not secular in the French sense, where you banish the wearing of religious garb or any references to religion in the public square. America has done best when it has been pluralistic rather than banishing religious discourse from the public square. And they brought religious discourse into the public square on every issue that arose, whether it was the Cherokee removal or women's rights or anti-slavery, or the need for public education. Enough on that.
Great,
Yeah,
John.
thank you.
We have a couple of questions in the chat bar, John.
Good.
Paul and Judy ask, where does Fruitlands enter into all of this?
Okay, this is, if you want to read a really amusing piece, read Louisa May Alcott's little book, Transcendental Wild Oats, which is her narrative of the little more than a year that she and her family spent at a short-lived utopian community called Fruitlands, started by her father, Bronson Alcott, after the school closed, and two other rather idealistic gentlemen, one of whom was from Britain. Well, Fruitlands, Bronson Alcott made today's vegans look absolutely carnivorous. The rule at Fruitlands was that you couldn't exploit any other creature. So poor Mrs. Alcott is depicted in Transcendental Wild Oats, darning linen socks. Now, linen was never meant for socks. It's rather fibrous and breaks. Doing this by the light of pine torches. Why? Well, you couldn't have cotton because that came from slaves. You couldn't have wool because that was stealing from the sheep. So you had linen to cover your body, but you couldn't have oil stolen from the whale in the lamps, nor wax stolen from the bee. You could use the pine torch. The name of the book comes from the fact that the three men in the community, and it was a small community that lasted 1 year, all went out because everybody was supposed to follow their own impulse about what they felt called to do to support the community. One went out and sowed the major field with wheat, and without consulting anybody else, another one went out and sowed the same field with rye, and the third one with oats. Now there's only one small problem. None of these three grains mature at the same time, and it's impossible to harvest any of them. So Transcendental Wild Oats is Louisa's send-up of a really idealistic and failed Transcendentalist community. Now, let me immediately leap to the fact that there was a better Transcendentalist community, which all too often gets short shrift. And of course, I mean Brook Farm, which developed very close to where Theodore Parker's church was located in West Roxbury when he was still the minister in the village there. And started by George Ripley and his wife, out of the attempt that they'd given up on the church as a solution to social and economic inequality. And they wanted to have a community in which people would work, but also be free to be creative. And through the efficiency of their shared labor, help one another be poets and musicians and the like. Well, it lasted better than most people think, and worked better. Not all individualists liked it. Nathaniel Hawthorne went there to try to save money and write, and he found that if he spent his morning mucking out the cow barn, he was not prepared to be very creative in the afternoon, and he eventually left. And he actually wrote a kind of a send-up of the whole thing in one of his novels. But recent studies of Brook Farm show that it accomplished nothing else. It freed up women. They didn't have to do all the domestic work. And one of the major early music critics of America was a Unitarian minister who kind of took refuge at Brook Farm. Margaret Fuller brought her troubled, younger brother to be housed there. But as the community grew, they built a great big new building, and it caught fire, another conflagration. And so it didn't die through internal processes, it died because there were no fire engines. So Fruitlands was a noble experiment, but an overly idealistic one. Again, I will say that I think Alcott, Emerson, and Thoreau represent the individualistic extreme of transcendentalism. Actually, Brook Farm is a good symbol of the overall effort within the movement for social reform. They were trying to tackle classism and economic inequality in a thoroughgoing way, and to liberate people, particularly women, to have leisure time in order to do creative work.
Thank you, John. We've got somebody in the chat bar asking if you can define transcendentalism.
Sure. It is a moral, spiritual revival movement that starts within the Unitarian churches, produces the American literary renaissance, and helps to launch the women's rights and abolitionist anti-racism of the 19th century, along with such reforms as public education. It doesn't go away. That's not a succinct definition. But because it's something of a sprawling spiritual moral revival movement, it can't be reduced to a simple formula, they all believed this. The term transcendental suggests, first of all, self-transcendence, trying to get past your ego to being something bigger than that. I'm reminded of one of my mentors who said that leadership is nothing more than having something left over after taking care of yourself to take care of things that are bigger than yourself. And he applied that, and I think it's that the Transcendentalists were right on there. Same wheelhouse. I noticed in the chat, the latest question was, were there any non-Christian Transcendentalists? And the answer is yes. The interesting thing is that some definitions of transcendentalism have tried to limit it to the people who transcended Christianity. But in fact, one of the things I show in my book is that a lot of them, especially people like Frederick Henry Hedge or James Freeman Clark or Julia Ward Howe or Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, they were all deeply devoted to a radical interpretation of the Christian tradition. They never left Christianity. That's why Clark's church was the church of the disciples, where they were actually going to not just mumble the religion about Jesus, they were going to try to practice the religion of Jesus. But along the way, they're opening their minds and their insights to sources from non-Christian traditions. And so, yes, by the time Emerson, I would say Thoreau is one of the first. He quits the church. And toward the end of his life, there are some remarks in his spiritual journals to the effect that he thinks of himself as kind of a freelance Buddhist. Well, I'm not sure any Buddhist would claim him, but he's post-Christian, clearly. Emerson, after the Civil War, joins the Free Religious Association, which is that branch of Transcendentalism which sees itself as being more ethical than biblical. And Moncure Conway comes to mind, who puts together the first anthology of readings from all of the world's religious traditions, and serves a congregation in South London that it becomes basically an ethical society. So yes, the Free Religious Association is also the progenitor then of later religious humanism, post-Christian. But one of the interesting things about the Transcendentalist movement is that the core people were still radical Christians. Anything else?
Yeah, John, the Reverend Sam Trembore says, we know the Unitarians were quite resistant to abolitionism in the 1830s when Samuel May was advocating for it. What were the key factors that move people related to Transcendentalism before the fugitive slave law that riles them up in 1850?
Yeah. Well, in the 1830s, one of the facts that blew me away as I did this research was to discover how violent the anti-abolitionist movement was. Every major city in the Northeast, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, all had major riots against the abolitionist movement. Now, how did the abolitionist movement emerge? Well, it's often dated in America to the publication of The Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison in 1830. The other thing that was going on was that New England was still tied to Old England culturally and otherwise, and the British were gearing up an abolitionist movement that resulted in 1833 in the emancipation of the enslaved peoples of the Caribbean islands that were under British control. By the way, it was not a complete abolition of slavery in all of the lands controlled by Britain. Didn't apply to India, for example. But they freed the slaves of Jamaica. Everybody was worried in that period that what would happen with the ending of slavery would be like what had happened in Haiti during the French Revolution, when there was a violent revolution led by enslaved people that killed many of the enslavers, the plantation owners, and drove the rest of them out. It didn't happen in Jamaica. It didn't happen in any of the British islands. There were some minor flurries, but one of the things that was going on in the 1830s was that people were looking for ways to end slavery short of civil war. good idea. You get people like Channing writing to Daniel Webster, who later becomes a supporter of the Fugitive Slave Act and a persona non grata to the Unitarians and the Transcendentalists. But Webster was being asked by Channing in the in the 1820s even, couldn't we dedicate some of the Western lands to the economic transition that will be necessary in the South to end slavery? That's what the British did. They put millions into ending the experiment in ending slavery in the Caribbean and they had a transitional period, which they called apprenticeship, about 6 years when the plantations had to provide the housing and food while paying the formerly enslaved and letting them leave if they wished. So a lot of people were looking at transitional ideas, and one of the worst ideas was colonization. Let's just, those who are freed from slavery, let's ship them back to Africa. That was fairly quickly rejected by most African Americans and by people like Garrison. But there were real problems in some of the thinking about abolitionism. Garrison came across as somebody who, first of all, his language was fairly violent and sort of hellfire and brimstone. And Channing was of the mind that you weren't going to get very far with ending this sin by just going after all of the sinners. I mean, a certain wing of the abolitionist movement, represented by Garrison, at a certain point wanted the North to secede from the South. Now think about that for a moment. I wash my hands, says Pontius Pilate. I'm pure. People like Douglas, who started out in the anti-slavery society with Garrison, at a certain point figured, wait a minute, that leaves my people enslaved in the South. Garrison burned the American Constitution at an anti-slavery rally. Frederick Douglass said, the way I read it, our founders expected slavery to be ended. It didn't happen, but the Constitution can be changed, and we can find in its preamble and in the Declaration of Independence the moral and spiritual bases for amending the American experiment in democracy. That's what eventually prevailed. That's why I consider Frederick Douglass one of the greatest Americans of all time. It would have been so easy for him to give up on the Constitution. Channing wasn't going to. Hell, his own father had helped to write it and get it passed in Rhode Island. He was anti-slavery, but he wasn't going to give up on amending the American experiment. Yeah, and Sam just put in something about John Quincy Adams, good Unitarian president, who goes back to Congress. You know, no American president has ever done something like that. Why? To speak against America's original sin and to see if he couldn't find a way to end it. It was not enough for him to just be the lead lawyer in the Amistad case. No, he went down to the House of Representatives to try to lift the gag rule, which said that the citizens couldn't have petitions against slavery heard by the Congress. There's a lot of noble action in here. There are also a lot of blind spots. I was strong on that this morning when I was preaching for the good people of Rochester. You know, the tendency to think that we have the right to judge the people in their social and cultural context according to contemporary standards is something that I utterly reject. I read Jamaica Kincaid this morning, who says, yeah, Lincoln was a racist, but he was against slavery, and that's good enough for me. You have to understand how complex some of the issues were. And by the way, the issues that we're enmeshed in are equally complex. And when we treat things too simplistically, historically, we have a tendency to do some of the self-congratulatory or hand-washing stuff that some of our forebears did at their worst. So I think a study of the Transcendentalists can really help us deal with some of the moral and spiritual complexities of negotiating a globalized economy, a threatened climate environment, a world in which human rights may be the goal, but where there's no immaculate conception of beloved community available. There are only difficult moral choices about how we can defend the worth and dignity of persons and defend democracy. By the way, somewhere down the line here, I'm going to talk about how our Transcendentalist forebears lived through a time that was as politically polarized as our own, and what the analogies are between, say, the border ruffians who came into bleeding Kansas in the 1850s, trying to defend the old order and slavery, and the militias of the right that rose up on January the 6th a year ago. We are in some deep stuff here. And the political and spiritual and moral context of our Transcendentalist forebears is tremendously relevant. So I think we're probably running out of time, Joe.
We have about 7 minutes left. I do have a few other questions in the chat bar.
I just want to say a little bit about the preview of coming attractions. Next week is going to be all about the forgotten, largely forgotten women in the Transcendentalist movement. I'm going to give you 6 brief bios and encourage some reading. And then the third session in this course is going to be on the anti-slavery movement. And there I want to make some analogies to what we're dealing with the right-wing populism in contemporary times. And the last is going to be about the roots of American environmentalism in the Transcendentalist movement. And somebody just asked, can we have a reading list? I do have available some sort of outlines of some of these remarks, because this is not the first time I've done this course. And I can provide a few suggestions about reading. The bibliography in my own book, it would be a good place to start. I'll just say that. So, Joe, a couple more questions? I'll try to be brief.
If you promise to be brief,
Yep.
I will ask, we'll go with the next question that was in the queue, which comes from Dan Forbush, who asks, have you reflected on the connection between Transcendentalism and transhumanism?
Yeah, sure. I mean, transhumanism is a 20th century idea that while the root of all religious experience is clearly human, what we are attempting to deal with in all spiritual traditions is something that transcends the human and that beckons to us in various ways and under various symbols to become what? Better than we are now. A good friend of mine recently preached a service, and why do we go to church? To become better people. So yes, there is a connection there.
Excellent. That was a really great brief answer. Well, John, I just want to thank you for your time this evening, and thanks to everyone who joined us. Please join us next Sunday night at the same time, and let us extinguish our chalices as we are together. We extinguish these flames, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. It's good
Amen.
to see all of you souls. Have a good week.
You too. Take care.
Actually, stick around real quick if I can make a quick pitch for putting up a little free love offering collection tonight. This program is a collaboration of many of our upstate New York congregations, and we want to keep the collaboration going. We want to raise some money so we can do a revival in the summer, try to get something together where we can all gather, hopefully in person, right? That's what you were talking about, John, with Transcendentalism as a spiritual and moral revival movement. So we want to get some of that revival energy going on in the modern moment. So of course, this class is completely free. You're already here, but we do invite a donation. You can simply give on our website, or you can mail us a check, but either way you do it, I put information in the chat. Just please either note or put in the memo line revival. That's how we'll know that it was donations given in response to this course, and that we will split it half with our wonderful presenter John Behrens, and half of the money raised will go towards that revival. So please give generously to that.
Very good. So I'm going to send you some stuff that can go out with next week's session, and perhaps a written pitch for that revival can go along with it. Since there's no registration, I don't know that you've been able to capture the email addresses of the people who've participated this evening. But if the recording can help with that, I do have some things that I customarily share with the course, if you can figure out a mechanism for getting them out there. Okay?
Sounds good. We'll work on that and figure that out.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Take care.